Back in the summer of 1985, Capcom released Ghouls'n Ghosts, an extremely difficult side-scrolling action game that had you battling all sorts of monsters while trying to rescue a princess kidnapped by an evil demon. It was an extremely well-made adventure, but that challenge was something else. Capcom was pleased with its performance and in late 1988 released a sequel to it called Ghouls'n Ghosts. It saw major upgrades in visuals, sound, and gameplay, while holding on to that same vicious challenge that had defined the original. The story continues the adventure of our hero Sir Arthur, who returns to the kingdom only to find its people slaughtered right down to every man, woman, and princess. Charging forward, your job is to defeat the diabolical Lucifer and save the souls of every human being you know. Sega recognized the arcade's quality and worked out a deal with Capcom to bring it to the Sega Genesis a mere 10 months after its arcade debut. It was handled in-house courtesy of Sega R&D 2 and programmed by none other than Yuji Naka himself. Sound was handled by Izuho Numata, who also worked on the likes of Ys Vanished Omen, Sonic 2, Dark Wizard, and Phantasy Star 4. Sega's version had the arcade pedigree, it had talented people behind it, but did it actually end up being something you'd want to play? In this episode, we will be taking a look at Ghouls'n Ghosts for the Sega Genesis, and talk a bit about its impact and quality as an arcade translation. Was it any good? Let's find out. Ghouls'n Ghosts starts out in a graveyard where you are immediately beset upon by some Grim Reaper-looking bad guys. From there, you start what is a brutal trip of arcade-style action platforming. As Sir Arthur, you have your armor as protection, but be careful. It only provides a single hit of protection from your foes. Once damaged, you are running around in your underwear, completely exposed to the countless dangers around you. Fortunately, you do have access to a projectile weapon right from the beginning. Arthur starts out with his trusty sword, which can be thrown at enemies above, beside, and below you. It can be upgraded to various other weapons as you move throughout the game. There's a giant axe that can be tossed, but it's really slow and clumsy. There's a super sword that is really powerful, but you can't throw it. The fire water can be thrown and acts like napalm, spreading at the point of impact. The dagger is a small projectile that is really fast and allows you to keep the damage constant. Finally, there is the discus, which covers a large area of damage. You can also gain access to suits of armor. Sometimes you can get your original armor back, and sometimes you will find the gold armor, which gives you magical powers depending on the weapon you are currently holding. Most of these weapons and armor can be gotten either by treasure chests or enemy drops. Beware, however, as treasure chests can also harbor the Magician, an aggressive enemy that can morph you into an old man or a duck, both leaving you highly vulnerable to attack. Your final item to pick up is a special weapon bestowed by a priestess that does massive damage and can even destroy enemy projectiles. Past your items, the gameplay is your typical side-scrolling affair of getting from point A to point B and fighting a big bad guy at the end of the level. A time limit pushes you through, and you'll not want to test it because it actually can be an issue at times. Enemies have an incredible amount of variety and most attack you in many different ways. Each new area presents new enemies to worry about, and rarely are they repeated. Finally, though there are only 5 levels in total, in order to see the true ending you will need to go through these stages twice, meaning this is a 10-level affair if you really want to claim the bragging rights as a true Ghouls'n Ghosts conqueror. Fortunately, you do have endless continues at your disposal. At its original release, Ghouls'n Ghosts was a 5 megabit graphical stunner. Side by side with the arcade original, you had to respect the work Sega did to get this game looking as good as it does. The stages are faithfully reproduced with lots of great color use that captures much of the detail seen in the original coin-op. From the grassy cemetery to the village on fire to the very heart of the enemy territory, each stage has at least 2 or 3 vastly different scenes to battle across. The enemies are very detailed as well, and the animation is a cut above the stuff you typically saw at the time. But what is so impressive is the sheer variety in them. Sega just didn't cut out half the bad guys and call it a day. They genuinely tried to give you what you faced in Capcom's original release, and it all looks superb, easily among the very best visuals the Genesis had available in its first year. When I first saw this in the magazines back then, even the low-res pictures couldn't hide just how powerful the visual presentation was gonna be here. The only real negative I can ding it with is the lack of an impressive background layer. But even then, it was far more wise to use the Genesis color on all those foreground details so as to keep up the closeness to the arcade. So really, Ghouls'n Ghosts was nothing short of a head-turner in 1989, and really showed you what the Genesis was capable of. Compared to its competition, nobody really had anything like it. It was the benchmark by which most early releases were judged, and honestly, was not thoroughly surpassed until Strider was released a year later. I really enjoyed a lot of the sound that early Genesis titles employed. The games were mostly coming out of Japan back then, and many of the developers had extensive experience with FM synth. It was a time before the GEMS driver sullied the reputation of the hardware, and the Genesis was often praised for its sound quality. And Ghouls'n Ghosts was no exception. Many of these tracks came off very well and sounded great. A few of the sound effects can be a bit abrasive, but overall the musical composition still holds up well now. Let's have a listen to a few examples to see if you agree. Like many Sega Genesis games back then, the difficulty of Ghouls'n Ghosts is the single largest factor in how most gamers will determine its quality. It permeates every aspect of the design, and if you are one to crumble under frustration, you will likely hate this from the moment you begin. This difficulty is not born of bad game design, however. It is a carefully constructed world of timing and skill. You see this in the way the game itself is laid out. Ghouls'n Ghosts is an extremely short adventure that needs 2 full playthroughs to see the true ending. There are only 5 stages, and each one can be beaten in mere minutes if you know what you're doing. But the fun is actually getting to that point. You'll need to know what's the best weapon for each area and boss. Learn where you need to be on the screen at the proper time. That only comes with the experience of countless deaths, and it makes you appreciate the journey that much more. When you finally do beat a stretch that has been dogging you out, there is a sense of victory that most other games at the time couldn't give you after a full play session. The arcade roots here may have been meant to swallow up your money without compassion, but it was undeniably built to reward those willing to put the time into it. There is also a major charm about its world. You start out in an ominous enough area, but are soon transported to areas that look and feel quite alien, almost as if you were fighting your way to another dimension. You never feel safe. Enemies are constantly respawning, and every boss is aggressive and right on top of you as soon as you see it. The soundtrack is also a big part of its appeal. As strange as the lands and enemies are, the music stays in step the entire way. In other words, the gameplay is solid, the sound and visual presentations are incredible, and it's one of the best examples of just how attractive early Genesis games could be to prospective consumers. Though as much as I hate to say it, this is not a perfect game by any stretch of the imagination. While I am quite secure in my conclusion it's a well-made game, the weapons are a real problem. Most of them are flat out useless if you are making any real attempt at defeating it. The axe is slow, the large sword has no distance, the fire water is complete garbage. That pretty much leaves just a few that you actually want to use, and to make matters worse, sometimes you cannot avoid picking them up. They drop in your path and you have to get them, potentially ruining a play session entirely since you keep them even after you die. So while the game may seem to give you a decent variety in terms of weapon choice, you will quickly find yourself using the same couple and employing the same techniques while doing so. It makes things one-dimensional, and since this is a short game, that is a shame. If the weapons were better balanced, this would have been much better for it. When Ghouls'n Ghosts was released in 1989, it was absolutely loved by the gaming press. Not only was it lavished with fantastic review scores, but it won a number of Game of the Year awards as well. Among that early batch of software, it stood apart as an undeniable example of what Sega's Genesis could do in terms of replicating the arcade experience at home. We had seen many arcade conversions before, but they were almost always stripped down to a point of hardly being recognizable. The Genesis version of Ghouls'n Ghosts gave us a glimpse of a future where home games could be just as impressive visually and just as faithful when it came to gameplay. Hot on the heels of its arcade success, there were other ports of this game to various console and computers in the years to follow. NEC Avenue did a version for the short-lived Supergrafx, an 8 megabit hue card that actually looked and played well itself. There was also an 8-bit version done for the Master System, which added upgrades that could make you faster, take more damage, and gain access to new weapons. There was also a version released for the Commodore Amiga. I didn't play this version until many years later, but I was still impressed with it when I saw it. But as far as Western releases, it was the Genesis that gave us the best way to play this at home for years. It really wasn't surpassed until the Capcom Generation options came out for the Saturn and PlayStation many years later. But even with more accurate options available now, the Genesis Edition still holds its own and is still very much a viable way to play this game. If the difficulty is weighing heavy on you, find a modern solution with save states to help alleviate the burden. It will take away some of the satisfaction of doing it on your own, but there is still enough here to make the adventure well worth your time. I'm Sega Lord X, thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.